The phone on Brett Caldwell's kitchen counter rang at 8:43 on a Tuesday morning in February of 2024, and he let it ring twice before he picked it up, the way he always did. He was standing at the sink, rinsing a coffee mug, looking out the window at the north quarter where the winter wheat had come in thin along the fence line. The caller ID read, First Ag Credit of Pahuska. He recognized it the way you recognize a face you haven't seen in a long time. Not with warmth, exactly. More with a quiet kind of interest in what the face had come to say. Brett, the voice said, this is Dale Murchison. How are you this morning? Brett said he was fine. Dale said he appreciated Brett's time, said the bank was reaching out to a number of long-time customers, said interest rates had softened some from their recent peaks, and they had some refinancing packages that might be worth a look. There was a practiced ease in Dale's voice, the unhurried confidence of a man who had spent 37 years offering things people needed. With your land holdings up around 400 acres now, Dale said, you might be carrying a note or two we could help you work down. Better terms, maybe lower your monthly exposure. Brett listened to all of it. He had learned that from his father, the listening. I appreciate you calling, Dale, he said when Dale had finished. I do. But I've got to tell you, I don't have a balance to refinance. Haven't had one since 2019. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not a long one, but long enough to have a shape to it. You're clear? Dale said. Clear, Brett said. He set the phone down on the counter after they said their goodbyes, picked up his mug, and went back to the window. The wheat along the fence line was still thin. He would need to watch that. He finished his coffee and pulled on his jacket and went out to the shop. Let me tell you how a man gets to that phone call, because it did not happen by accident, and it did not happen overnight. And it did not happen in any way that the people around Brett Caldwell would have predicted in the early years of his operation, when the conventional wisdom in Osage County was that a farmer who wouldn't borrow was a farmer who wouldn't grow. Howard Caldwell farmed 160 acres of Osage County ground his entire working life, and he never once carried a land debt past a single crop year. He was not opposed to operating notes, short-term borrowing against a specific input cost or a specific harvest, the kind of debt you could trace directly to a seed bag or a fuel bill, and retire the moment the grain ticket came in. What he was opposed to, in a quiet and total way, was the kind of debt that outlasted the thing it purchased. Interest doesn't sleep, he told Brett once, sitting at the same kitchen table where Brett still took his coffee 30 years later. It works the night shift. Every single night, you own it. Brett was 17 when his father said that. He did not fully understand it at 17. He understood it completely by 25, which was the age at which understanding a thing like that begins to cost you something or save you something, and there is no third option. Howard kept a ledger book in the left-hand drawer of his desk, a green cloth-covered thing with his name written on the inside cover in his own careful hand, and every year he wrote down what he owed, what he was owed, what the land had produced, and what he had paid for the privilege of farming it. Not a complicated system. Not a system any agricultural college would have recognized as sophisticated. Just a running account of where things stood. Recorded in pencil so the numbers could be corrected when the numbers changed. When Howard died in the spring of 1987, he left Brett the 160 acres free and clear of any land debt, the farmhouse, the shop, an International tractor from 1974 that ran well if you knew its habits, and the green ledger book with 31 years of entries in it. He also left a small operating note of $28,000 against the prior year's input costs, the one debt in Howard's ledger that had not yet been settled. The note was held by First Ag Credit of Pawhuska. Brett drove into Pawhuska 3 weeks after the funeral to meet with the lender and discuss terms. He was 28 years old. He was wearing the same canvas work jacket he had worn all winter, faded at the elbows, and he drove the 1974 tractor's Barnmate, a 1979 Ford pickup with 214,000 miles on it, and a passenger-side window that would not open past halfway. He parked in front of the credit office on Keheka Avenue and went inside. The man behind the desk was Dale Murchison, who was then 34 years old, recently promoted to senior AG loan officer, wearing a pressed Western shirt with pearl snap buttons and a pair of Tony Lama boots that caught the fluorescent light when he moved. Dale stood up and extended his hand and said it was good to meet Brett, that he had known of Howard. That Howard had been a good customer of the bank for many years. He was, Brett said. Dale went through the terms of the $28,000 note with a practiced thoroughness, explaining the interest rate, the repayment schedule, the bank's flexibility on seasonal timing. He was not unkind. He was, in fact, quite cordial. The way a man is cordial when he is in his natural element and is confident you need what he has. At the end of his explanation, he leaned back in his chair and looked at Brett with a careful, assessing kind of attention. "Now," Dale said, "your daddy farmed that ground lean. Didn't expand much. I understand you might want to think about your own direction going forward. We could put together an operating package for you, set you up with some capital to work with. A man just starting out, it's not unusual to carry some debt while you're building." Brett looked at him for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "I'm going to take care of this $28,000 first and see where I stand." Dale nodded with the patient smile of a man who expected to see this particular customer again within a year. "Well, son," he said, "you know where we are." Brett knew where they were. He paid the $28,000 in 4 years, making his last payment in the spring of 1991, running the 160 acres on the tightest operating budget in the county. He grew winter wheat and milo on a rotation his father had settled on in the 1960s after watching 2 neighboring farms blow out their soil, trying to force a third crop into a 2-crop system. He did his own maintenance on the 1974 International. He did not buy a new truck. He did not upgrade the shop. He put the margin he cleared above operating costs into a savings account at a community bank in Pawhuska, a separate bank from First Ag Credit, which struck some of his neighbors as unusual, but which was simply a thing he had decided. Now here is where you need to know about Kenny Ogle, because Kenny is important to understanding what Brett was watching from the road and what it cost him to keep watching without changing his mind. Kenny farmed a quarter section directly east of Brett's ground, the same 160 acres his own family had worked since the 1950s, and Kenny was a good farmer in every practical sense. He knew his soil. He could read weather the way some men read a clock. He kept his equipment clean, and he treated his ground honestly. The difference between Kenny and Brett was not knowledge or effort or even ambition. The difference was the instrument Kenny used to act on what he knew. In the spring of 1993, Kenny Ogle financed the purchase of a second quarter section of a land to the south of his home place, 160 acres of decent creek-bottom ground that came available when the Rafferty family decided to sell. He borrowed $210,000 from First Ag Credit of Pawhuska at 9.5% interest, a 30-year note, and Dale Murchison arranged it with the same practiced ease he brought to everything. The day Kenny signed the papers, he also signed a line of credit on a new combine, a wide-cut machine that cost more than Brett's entire operating budget for 3 years running. Kenny drove it home on a Thursday afternoon, and Brett watched it pass on the county road from his tractor seat. All that green and yellow iron moving slow and magnificent in the June light. Dale Murchison thought Kenny Ogle was the model of a well-run, expanding operation. He said so at the First National Bank's annual Ag Credit Luncheon in the fall of 1993, where he mentioned Kenny by first name as an example of a farmer who understood how to use leverage to grow. He did not mention Brett Caldwell at that luncheon. Brett was not there. Brett was in his shop replacing a water pump on the 1974 International. The public accounting came a year later at the Heartland Co-op on Highway 60, where the farmers of Osage County gathered most Saturday mornings to buy inputs, drink coffee from a pot that had been on since 5, and conduct the informal business of knowing each other's operations better than their own bank statements. Brett was there on a Saturday in November of 1994, pulling on his jacket by the door, when Kenny Ogle came in with a man Brett recognized as a seed sales representative from Enid, a wide, well-dressed fellow named Gary who sold proprietary wheat varieties and kept a company, pickup cleaner than most men kept their living rooms. Gary saw Brett leaving and said something to Kenny in a low voice, and Kenny glanced over and said, not quite quietly enough, "That's Caldwell. He farms Old Howard's place. Doesn't really expand much." And Gary looked at Brett's jacket and his truck out the window and said, "Dirt rich, poor farmer, you know the type." And they both laughed, not cruelly, just carelessly, the way men laugh at a harmless observation about someone they've already categorized. Brett heard it. He zipped his jacket and went out to the truck. He did not tell Ruth that evening what had been said. He did not need to. Ruth Caldwell had grown up 2 townships over, the daughter of a soybean farmer who had watched 3 of his neighbors lose ground in the 1980s farm crisis. And she had a specific instinct for the kind of observation that was meant to settle a person down into their assumed place. She knew without being told what certain people in the county thought of a man who drove a '79 Ford and farmed inherited ground without expanding. She was not troubled by it. She was steadier than Brett in some ways, which was saying something, because Brett was very steady. The year that tested that steadiness was 1998. It was a drought year across the southern plains, the kind of dry that comes in April and stays until after the wheat has shriveled, and the milo hasn't got the moisture to germinate, and the farmer is looking at a partial crop on a good year's input cost. Brett's wheat came in at about 40% of normal yield. He had crop insurance, which covered a portion of the loss, and he had 4 years of banked margin sitting in that community bank account, which covered the rest. He did not go to First Ag Credit. He did not need to. But that summer, sitting at the kitchen table on a night when the heat had not let up and the North Quarter looked gray in the dry wind, Ruth put her hand flat on the table between them and said, "What if the next year is the same?" Brett looked at her hand. He said, "It won't be." "You don't know that," she said. "No," he said. "I don't." He sat with that for a long time, long enough that Ruth got up and washed the 2 coffee cups and went to bed before he said anything else. He sat at that table alone and went through the numbers the way his father had taught him to go through numbers, not reaching for an answer, just looking at what was actually there. What was there was this. He had 4 years of banked margin. He had a paid-off tractor that still ran honest. He had 160 acres of ground with no debt against it, and he had a crop insurance settlement coming in 6 weeks. What was not there was a refinancing call to make, or a lender to negotiate with, or a monthly payment that didn't sleep. He went to bed. The next year was not the same. The winter wheat of 1999 came in at 91% of his 10-year average, and he banked the margin again. In the spring of 2001, the estate of a family named Pruett put 80 acres of mixed ground up for quiet sale, no auction, just a notice through the county recorder's office and a phone call to 3 neighbors whose land adjoined it. Brett was one of those 3 neighbors. The ground was not premium creek bottom like Kenny's southern quarter, but it was honest ground, well-drained, that had been in small grain production for 40 years without being mined. The asking price was $80,000. Brett called the Pruett family attorney and made an offer of $64,000. Cash, no contingencies, 30-day close. The attorney called back in 2 days and said yes. Brett did not mention it at the co-op. He did not mention it to Dale Murchison. He drove home from the title company in Pawhuska with the deed in his jacket pocket and stopped at the north edge of the new 80 acres and walked the fence line, which needed work, and looked at the soil, which was good. He was 42 years old. He now farmed 240 acres, all of it carrying no debt. He went home and wrote the transaction in his father's green ledger book, in pencil, in the same column where Howard had written the original 160 acres in 1956. While Brett was walking fence lines and writing in ledger books, Kenny Ogle was farming 320 acres of leveraged ground and running 2 combines and a 4-wheel drive tractor he'd financed in 2005 at a rate that looked reasonable in the commodity boom years and less reasonable when the numbers shifted. In the summer of 2008, when wheat touched $8 a bushel and corn was trading at levels that made the news every morning, Kenny refinanced the original $210,000 note, which by then had been partly paid down over 15 years to somewhere around $140,000, and rolled it into a larger consolidated note with First Ag Credit that covered land, equipment, and an additional operating line. Dale Murchison arranged it. The terms made sense in 2008, the way a lot of things made sense in 2008 that would not make sense in 2012. Brett watched the commodity boom from the same tractor seat he had always occupied. His wheat checks were larger in those years, the same yield multiplied by a better price, and he did not change his operating posture in response. He banked the margin. He replaced the 1974 International in 2006 with a used 1988 model he bought from an estate sale in Pawnee County for $11,000 cash. It was a step up in horsepower and a step sideways in age, which suited him fine. He drove it home on a Sunday, and Kenny Ogle saw it pass on the county road and shook his head from his driveway in a way that was not unkind, just the gesture of a man watching a friend make a choice he himself would not make. Kenny's wife, Darlene, mentioned Brett to a woman at church that same fall, saying something along the lines of it being a shame that some men couldn't bring themselves to move forward, couldn't see that the opportunity was right there in the numbers if you were willing to use the tools available. The woman at church told the story to her husband, who told it at the co-op the following Saturday morning. Brett heard it third hand, the way you hear most of the things said about you in a small county. He did not respond to it. He was busy that week rebuilding the fence on the pre-wet 80s east side, which had finally gotten bad enough that the cattle from the neighboring pasture were coming through. If you are watching this channel for the first time, take a moment and subscribe. The stories here are long and careful, and they pay off at the end, and the next one will come to you directly if you're signed up. Now, back to Osage County. The commodity correction of 2012 was not a crash in the dramatic sense. It was a softening, a settling, a slow decline from the peak that would have been survivable for most operations if the operations had not been built to the dimensions of the peak. The price of winter wheat fell from $8 to around $5.50 over 18 months. Input costs held. Interest rates did not stay as accommodating as they had been in the refinancing years. Kenny's consolidated note from 2008 carried a variable rate component that Dale had structured to their mutual satisfaction at the time, and when the rate adjusted in late 2012, his monthly payment increased by enough to matter on a $500 wheat market. Kenny held on through 2012. He sold the newer combine and went back to running one machine. He sold the four-wheel drive tractor and hired custom work for his deep-till passes. He had a frank conversation with Dale Murchison in the spring of 2013 that Brett heard about through the county's informal network of people who work adjacent to each other's business without meaning to. The conversation ended with Dale agreeing to a restructuring on the note, but the restructuring required the sale of the southern quarter section, the 160 acres of creek-bottom ground Kenny had bought in 1993, to bring the debt load to a manageable ratio. The land went to auction in October of 2013. Brett did not bid. The ground went to a land investment company out of Tulsa for $280,000, which was a fair price in 2013, and a number that covered Kenny's outstanding note with a small amount left over. Kenny stood in the auction barn in his good jacket and watched it happen with the particular stillness of a man who has already processed the thing that is occurring and has moved past the stage of wishing it were otherwise. Brett saw him across the barn and nodded. Kenny nodded back. That was the most that was said between them about it. Kenny kept farming his original home quarter after the auction, working it on a leaner operating structure. And he was a better farmer for it, in some measurable ways, more attentive to input costs, more precise about his soil fertility numbers, more deliberate about when to sell and when to store. Loss has a way of teaching the lessons that profit lets you defer. Brett finished buying the ground that would make his operation complete over the following 6 years. In 2014, he purchased 160 acres adjoining his original home place to the north, a private sale from a retired couple named Bellingham who wanted a quick, clean transaction. He paid $194,000 and financed $80,000 of it on a 10-year note at a fixed rate, the only land debt he had carried since the original operating note of 1987. He structured the payment at $2,200 a month, which his grain operation could carry comfortably without touching his banked reserves, and he retired the note in 2019, 5 years early, sending the final check of $47,000 against the remaining balance on a Friday morning in March, when the wheat was already 3 inches tall in the north fields. He wrote the final payment in the green ledger book. 400 acres, no debt. He was 60 years old. He called Ruth in from the mudroom where she was sorting seed catalogs, and she stood in the doorway, and he told her the note was done. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Good." She went back to the catalogs. That was enough. Between two people who have been paying attention to the same set of numbers for 30 years, it did not need to be more. Now let me tell you about Hector Vines, because the story does not end with the note being retired and the ledger being closed. It ends somewhere past that, with a decision Brett made that had nothing to do with his own position and everything to do with what his father would have recognized as the proper use of a paid-off life. Hector had been renting Brett's north quarter, the Bellingham ground, for 3 growing seasons, and he was 29 years old in the spring of 2023, a first-generation grain farmer who had come up working custom harvest crews across Kansas and Oklahoma before he scraped together enough capital to lease ground and run his own operation on a shoestring that would have been familiar to Brett in 1987. Hector was careful with his inputs. He kept decent records. He asked Brett questions about the ground, about the soil structure, and the drainage patterns, and the way the north end tended to stay wet 2 weeks longer than the south end after a wet April. And he listened to the answers the way Brett had learned to listen, without filling the space before the answer was complete. Brett watched him for 3 seasons. He watched the way Hector managed his operating costs on $40 an acre rented ground, the way he structured his lease payments to match his harvest timing, the way he kept his one older combine running on repairs he did himself in a rented shop space outside Pawhuska. He reminded Brett of something, not of himself exactly, but of the shape of himself at that age, the particular combination of competence and exposure that describes a man who has the knowledge and not yet the ground. In November of 2023, Brett called Hector to the kitchen table and told him he was considering selling the North Quarter. He said the market value of the 80 acres in its current condition was somewhere around $260,000, which was accurate for Osage County farmland at that moment. He said he would sell it to Hector for $185,000 on a 5-year right of first option, meaning Hector had 5 years to arrange financing or accumulate the purchase price, and Brett would carry the note himself at a fixed rate of 4%, which was below any AG credit rate available in the current market by a meaningful margin. Hector sat with that for a long moment. He said, "That's not fair to you." Brett said, "I didn't say it was fair. I said it was the offer." Hector said he would need some time. Brett said to take it. Hector signed the option agreement 2 weeks later on a Wednesday morning, and Brett recorded it at the county clerk's office in Pawhuska that same afternoon. He came home and wrote the transaction in the green ledger book in pencil, a different hand in the same column, $75,000 below market. He sat with that number for a moment, and then he closed the book and put it back in the left-hand drawer of the desk. It was the following February that Dale Murchison called. Dale had been a good lender for 37 years in Osage County, and he was not a dishonest man. He had operated within the logic of his profession, which told him that responsible farm expansion required credit access and that a farmer who refused credit was either afraid or uninformed. He had been right about that in a great many cases. He had also been wrong in some cases that he remembered clearly, Kenny Ogle's 2008 refinancing being one of them. A decision made in good faith on numbers that looked solid at the peak of a market he had not fully accounted for turning. He had not been wrong about Brett Caldwell exactly. He had simply not been able to see Brett's ledger from across the desk in 1987, or from the AE Credit Luncheon in 1993, or from any of the occasional transactions they had conducted over the years when Brett came in to discuss operating terms. He ultimately declined. What Dale had seen was a man with a paid-off old tractor who drove a wore-out truck and didn't expand at the pace that the land market would have supported. And the logic available to Dale in that setting had told him that this man was either cautious to a fault or constrained by resources he didn't have. The possibility that the constraint was a preference, that the worn jacket and the old truck were not markers of limitation, but of discipline, was a possibility that the logic of Dale's profession made genuinely hard to see. So when Dale called in February of 2024 with refinancing terms, he was acting in perfectly good faith inside the same logic he had always used, And it was only when Brett said he had no balance to refinance that the logic updated in real time. The way a row of numbers will sometimes simply change what they are when you add a figure you hadn't included before. "You're clear?" Dale said. "Clear," Brett said. There was a pause. In that pause, if you were listening carefully, you could hear 37 years of a certain assumption being quietly set down. Dale said, "Well, that's something, Brett." Brett said it had taken a while. Dale said it had. And there was something in his voice that was not quite an apology and not quite admiration, but was a combination of both that Dale was not accustomed to feeling about a conversation he had initiated. He said, "Your daddy would have been proud," Brett said. "Yes, I think he would." They said goodbye, and Brett set the phone on the counter and stood at the window a little longer than he needed to. The wheat along the north fence line was still thin. He had already decided to go over it with a light top dress of nitrogen in the next dry window to give it a chance to thicken before the cold broke and the growing season opened in earnest. He had also decided, in the way he made most decisions, quietly and without announcing it, that he was going to drive out to Hector's shop that afternoon and walk through the North Quarter's drainage pattern with him before the spring wet season arrived, because Hector needed to understand the way the east tile emptied and where to watch for standing water along the second cross fence. Ruth was in the mudroom when he came through. She said, "Was that the bank?" He said it was. She said, "What did they want?" He said they had called to offer him refinancing terms. She looked at him. "I told them I didn't have a balance," he said. Ruth turned back to what she had been doing. She said, "I should hope not." He drove out to Hector's shop in the 2007 Ford he had bought, used in 2011, which now had just over 308,000 miles on it, and ran with the particular reliability of a truck that has been maintained carefully and never asked to be anything it wasn't. He drove it on the county road past Kenny Ogle's home quarter, where Kenny was already in the field with his one combine doing a preseason check, and Brett lifted 2 fingers off the wheel as he passed, the county road wave, and Kenny raised a hand in return. They had not talked directly about the 2013 auction since the auction, but they talked about other things: the wheat market, the county road maintenance schedule, the way the new tile district to the south was going to change drainage patterns across 3 townships. They were still neighbors. That had not changed. The debt had changed, and the equipment had changed, and the number of acres Kenny farmed had changed, but the fact of their being neighbors on the same county road, watching the same weather and growing the same crops, had not changed and was not going to. Hector was at his shops, a rented metal building on the edge of Pawhuska, when Brett pulled in. He had his combine's feeder house apart on a concrete floor, and he was cleaning the chain with the focused attention of a man who understands that mechanical cleanliness is a financial decision. He stood up and wiped his hands on a rag and said good morning. Brett said good morning. He said he wanted to walk the North Quarter with Hector before the spring wet season, specifically the east tile outlet and the low corner by the second cross fence. He said it wasn't complicated, but it mattered, and he wanted Hector to see it with his own eyes before he owned the ground rather than after. Hector said he appreciated that. He said he was 2 hours from finishing the feeder house chain, and then he'd be free. Brett said to take his time, that he would wait in the truck and drink the rest of his coffee. He sat in the truck for 2 hours in the pale February light, looking at the country he had farmed for 37 years. The wheat was coming in thin along the north fence line and thick along the south exposure, where the ground held heat a little longer into the fall planting window. The sky over the western horizon had the gray-white texture of a system building, maybe 2 days out. And if it came wet and then froze hard, it would flatten the thin stands, and he would need to think about replanting a strip along the east edge in March. He ran the numbers on that in his head the same way he had run numbers for 37 years, without urgency, just looking at what was actually there. 400 acres. No debt. One note to Hector at 4%, which Brett carried as an asset rather than a liability, a detail his father would have appreciated. He finished his coffee when Hector came out of the shop, and he got out of the truck, and they drove together out to the North Quarter in Hector's pickup, which had about 190,000 miles on it, and a broken door handle on the passenger side that Hector had fixed with a strip of braid rope tied through the latch. Brett looked at the rope and did not say anything. He had fixed the same door handle on the '79 Ford 3 times before he replaced the truck, and he had used a piece of wire the second time and a bolt from a coffee can the third time, and all 3 solutions had worked. They walked the east tile outlet, and Brett showed Hector where the outlet tended to ice over in late February and back up into the low corner if there was a wet freeze after a good rain. He showed him the second cross fence where the water pooled in a wet year and stayed 3 weeks past drainage everywhere else, and he told Hector that the east 30 acres of that quarter ran about 8% more bushels per acre in a wet year because of the moisture retention, and about 10% less in a dry year for the same reason, and that the way to manage it was to scout it separately from the rest of the quarter and make the nitrogen and fungicide decisions for that section on its own numbers rather than averaging it with the rest. Hector listened to all of it without interrupting. Brett said, "You've been walking this ground for 3 years. You probably knew some of that." Hector said, "I knew the corner. I didn't know the drainage timing." Brett nodded. That was the useful part. A man could see the low corner by walking it. The drainage timing took years to know. They walked back to the trucks in the pale morning, and Brett got back into his Ford, and Hector said he would call that week about the spring operating schedule for the North Quarter, what inputs he was planning to run, and at what rates, so Brett could see what the ground was going to carry before the close of the first growing season of the option period. Brett said that sounded right. He drove home on the county road in the February light, 2 fingers lifting for Kenny Ogle's drive as he passed, and he pulled into his own lane and parked in front of the shop and sat a moment before he got out. The farmhouse was the same white frame structure his father had built in 1961, re-roofed twice and resided once, with the same kitchen window looking north over the home quarter toward where the Bellingham ground began. The shop was the same metal building Howard had put up in 1968, sheet metal replaced on the south wall in 2009 when a storm took a panel. The same land, the same buildings, the same kitchen table. He went inside and hung his jacket on the peg in the mudroom and washed his hands at the sink. Ruth was at the kitchen table with a seed catalog and a cup of coffee, and she looked up when he came in and she said, "How's the tile?" He said the tile was fine. He said Hector was going to need to watch the east corner in a wet February, but he understood it now. Ruth went back to the catalog. Brett poured himself a coffee and stood at the north window and looked at the thin wheat along the fence line. He would top-dress it in the next dry window. He would walk it first, count the stand in a few measured strips, see what was actually there before he decided what it needed. He set his coffee on the sill and went to the desk in the corner and opened the left-hand drawer and took out the green ledger book. He opened it to the last written page where Howard's careful pencil entries had given way to Brett's own hand, and he looked at the column of numbers that ran from 1987 to 2024. 37 years of what was owed and what was owed back and what the land had produced, and what had been paid for the privilege of farming it. He did not add anything to the page. There was nothing new to write. He held the book for a moment, the cloth cover worn smooth at the corners from 37 years of the left-hand drawer, and then he closed it and put it back. Outside the north window, the wheat was thin along the fence line, and thick along the south exposure, and the gray-white system was building 2 days out to the west, and the land was his, all 400 acres of it, clear and quiet and carrying no debt, except the one he had chosen to carry toward a younger man who reminded him of something worth carrying. The lamp on the desk was still on. He left it.